Ladies and gentlemen, Richard and Judith Selby Lang.
Are we here?
Can we be in the light?
Yeah.
How's that? We don't need the podium. No, come on. Come on over.
I like the podium.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. We are so pleased to be here today. We can't thank you enough for inviting us. We never could have thought, had the idea that picking up trash from the beach would bring us to such a global philanthropy forum.
Well, we are the world's smallest NGO. It's the two of us.
2 people, 1,000 yards of one beach. In 1999, we began this incredible journey picking up trash. And over the years, we've collected from this one beach in the Point Reyes National Seashore, just north of San Francisco, over 2 tons of plastic debris that we fashion into artwork.
But I should say we're only picking up the good stuff.
Yeah. How do we do the slides here? I need help.
Push the button.
I'm pushing. There we go. Oh, there we go. Oh, our time is going by. Kehoe Beach in the Point Reyes National Seashore is where we had our first date in 1999. A love of a place, a person, and a planet ensued.
So we're on our first date, and Judith picks up a piece of plastic, and I say, "Are you going to keep that?"
And he picks a piece of plastic, and I say, "Are you going to keep that?" And out of that forged an incredible collaboration. You might imagine our heartbreak when we go to the beach, and it looks like there's been a party going on. There's a confetti strew of small and large pieces of plastic. And when we go to pick up, we say that we are curating the beach more than cleaning the beach because we're artist first.
So imagine our surprise in the middle of this great despair of finding this stuff on the beach. We find a Monopoly house.
Pretty great. So,
and we were warned before we came here. They said, "You're going to talk about Monopoly? That's an American game." Come on. It's been translated into 130 languages. It's been localized to 2,700 cities around the world. The latest is Lagos, Nigeria.
But what we love about this tiny piece of plastic, this one small speck in that vast strew, is that it has an incredible story to tell, and a story that's really relevant to us being here today.
So as we looked up Monopoly, we find it was not invented by Parker Brothers in 1938, but really was invented by a woman named Lizzie Magie, who was an acolyte of a famous economist who was making games so that people could have the feeling of the economy. And so she invented this game in order to evoke the shame at dominating your neighbors.
How'd that go? Not exactly, not exactly. So what does art have to do with all of this? We're called upon to be artist first here. And this idea of what we can bring to the table. So I'm reminded of a poem by W.S. Merwin called High Water, and we offer this as a kind of a blessing for our convocation today.
So this is High Water, W.S. Merwin, former poet laureate of the United States. Look him up, he's great. The poem High Water. The river is rising, and with the breathless sound of a fever, the bank along each shore trembles and is torn away. A few steps up on the bank, the rows of faces watch under their dripping hats. When the faces draw closer together, they talk as members of one family, saying what should be moved if they have to move it. They talk of the gardens of the hills and what the spring means to the summer. And they speak even of the lake and the mountains, which they own together and agree once again never to sell.
We invite you to join us this evening. We have many, many other stories to tell. We will be doing a hands-on workshop. You will be able to join us in our creative process. We've brought piles of plastic, All of the plastic we will be working with this evening, either Richard or I have hand-picked. We have selected for this evening. We have bent over and picked up thousands of pieces of plastic. We call it our stoop yoga, and we invite you to join us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we should give them another hand because I was going to just say because they had a red golf ball in there, which I've never seen. I don't know what you do with a red golf ball. Hi. Thank you, Richard and Judith, for your Ingenuity Spark. Everyone here will have a chance to engage with them at the Creation Station, where you'll be able to create art from the plastic that they and others have found in the ocean, which I think will be a lot of fun. My name is Larry Brilliant. I'm the president and CEO of the Skoll Global Threats Fund. I'll tell you more about that later, but I'm going to be moderating this plenary, which is called Ensure Sustainability, Preserving the Earth's Biodiversity and Physiology. This is the plenary that introduces the problem-solving working groups of the planet track. And I'd just like to thank Jane for inviting me back. It's really nice to be back. It's been a while. It's nice to be back among family again. Thank you. Now I get the opportunity to invite Nancy Birdsall to come on up. Nancy is the president of the Center for Global Development. She has extensive experience for such a young woman in development research, policy and management in various organizations like the World Bank, Inter-America Development Bank, and she will try to begin by providing some context for tackling development changes and the climate dilemma. Nancy.
Thank you very much, Larry, and thank you to Jane Wales and the community that she has fostered of all of you out there. I think it's really quite extraordinary. I asked myself when Jane asked if I would give a talk here, why me? I saw that the context was citizen action, and I saw that the specific session was on the Earth's biodiversity and physiology, on which I am no expert. And I saw that I would be talking to people, many of whom are from Silicon Valley, and I come from Washington, D.C., which is kind of the other world. And so I thought I better not give you the typical policy nerd speech, that it would be better to tell you a story. So I'm going to tell you a story about a colleague of mine named David Wheeler, whom I consider the unsung hero of forest preservation in the developing world. Then I'm going to tell you what David's story has to do with this forum and this session on the Earth's biodiversity and physiology. And then I'm going to end with a kind of plea to all of you out there, whom I consider, all of you, by virtue of your being here, global citizens in the best sense of the word. So let me start with David. He's a former colleague of mine, an academic, researcher, economist, econometrician, a quant kind of guy. Also, however, a problem solver. And I met David when he came to the World Bank at a time when the World Bank was under a lot of pressure in the mid-'80s to be dealing with environmental issues and sustainability. And he got interested and made himself into an environmental economist. One of the things that he did as a researcher was spend a lot of time working on a series of projects in Indonesia that had to do with reducing water pollution. He did research on the impact on polluters' behavior of public information disclosure, which was part of the deal that was made in the context of World Bank financing for reducing water pollution. One of the things he told me years later is that with information to the public about the pollution behavior of the big companies, big industrial firms in Indonesia, it had an impact. For example, the big banks actually started to alter the interest rates that they charged their borrowers, the big firms, as a function of their pollution behavior, on the grounds that those who were polluting a lot were presumably badly managed and then higher risk borrowers. The project in Indonesia, including this public information disclosure, became a model for water pollution prevention projects all over Asia, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in China. And I think it gave David a sense that public information disclosure matters. And you heard a little bit about this in the earlier session from Sanjay from the World Bank, the power of people knowing what's going on. I urged David Wheeler to come to the Center for Global Development, the think and do tank that I had in about 2005, because I could see he was a terrific researcher, a real serious academic guy, and we want to have world-class scholars who have credibility on the issues they work on, and also a problem solver, a do sort of person. And David got interested in forests. And he got frustrated because he's a data guy. And what he found is that it was hard to get data on deforestation trends and facts in tropical forest countries like the Congo, Brazil, Indonesia, many others, parts of Africa. The problem was that the data were being collected by academics and scientists, where the premium in academic terms was on accuracy and detail. And in the community concerned with climate issues, there was a high premium on very specific information about the carbon content of different forest areas and literally different trees. But it was taking up to 5 years and sometimes more before these data were available to the larger public, to the research community, and to citizens. So there was no way to use the kind of interventions that the public, that disclosure that's timely was making in the case of, say, water pollution in Asia at the country level. So even today, the fact is that only Brazil, among all developing countries, has a really well-developed on-the-ground system of monitoring, reporting, and verification of changes in forest cover, and thus in rates of deforestation. And in Brazil, it is becoming something that's kind of crowdsourced, and citizens actually generate alerts, as well as the official system uses alerts when, for example, it's clear that there's illegal burning of forests associated with agro-industry. Well, David got very excited because he realized at some point that NASA has these satellites, right, that are circling the Earth all the time. And the satellites are taking pictures all the time. He got together with a couple of brilliant research assistants at the center, and they, in effect, wrote the code that links the pictures that the satellites are generating to changes in forest cover at the ground level. The algorithm, the platform, I'm not even sure what to call it myself, but anyway, they did something that resulted in high resolution, high frequency, monthly data on changes in forest cover across the developing world. They ground truthed it in Brazil, where, as I said, there was on the ground process for monitoring and reporting. And David called the resulting platform FORMA, F-O-R-M-A, which stands for Forest Monitoring for Action. That's the problem-solving part. Action including through citizen engagement and involvement. Eventually, we asked the World Resources Institute, another think tank in Washington, to take on Forma and deepen it, make it more user accessible. And the World Resources Institute with us has entered into a partnership with Google and other sponsors. It's a $20 million operation now at even higher frequency and lower levels of aggregation on the ground. I love this story. That's why I told it to you, because it kind of takes David Wheeler, my colleague, from the bowels, of policy, public policy think tank and World Bank in Washington, wonkdom, here to Silicon Valley, high tech, big data, innovation. So let me tell you my sense of what David's virtual journey from Washington, D.C. to Silicon Valley has to do with what this forum is about. Research and data are one part of an ecosystem in which we are all participating. It's an ecosystem with respect to forests that's bringing together people and institutions concerned with the devastating risks that climate change poses for the world's poor countries and poor people, and thus the risk to the whole development project that climate change represents. So research and data are one part of the ecosystem. A second part is citizen activism, something that's going on here right now. So what I think of as benign lobbying, right? And in a few moments, Carol Larson from the Packard Foundation is going to tell you about the role of citizen activists in a big victory for forest preservation in Indonesia that she might not say, but I want to tell you, was enabled in part by the ability of citizens and civil society groups to pinpoint the source at the plantation level of the fires that were burning in Indonesia about a year ago, and to take steps as a result of that. So that's two parts of the ecosystem, data and research and what us policy wonk people do, and what citizen activists can do. There's a third part of the ecosystem that you heard a little bit about today in the earlier session, and that I want to also emphasize, which is what governments do and what global institutions do, what public policy is and how it matters, whether governments do or don't do certain things, what the World Bank does, and what's happening at the United Nations as well. Sometimes the combination of information and citizen activism is enough to make a big difference. And I think many of you out there are engaged in all kinds of activities where it may well be enough. But I do think on some issues, it's not enough. There has to be changes and fixes to public policy at the country level and at the global level. That's particularly the case in climate. It's just not possible to imagine that we are going to tackle the problems that climate change is going to cause and is causing already for the world's poor and for building middle-class societies that are prosperous and stable, where there's justice for people, without a fix in the public policy arrangements at the global level and at the country level. How do we create incentives in the absence of the big global deal that many of us are frustrated about and isn't happening yet, but let's hope does happen in 2020? How do we create incentives for governments like Indonesia with commercial pressures in the palm oil sector, like Guyana with gold mining pressures, like Liberia pulp and paper, timber and logging, iron ore. We need incentives for these governments to deal with the tremendous commercial pressures that are coming from the global market. Even the most responsible governments at the highest levels in developing countries don't have the institutions, don't have the policing and the court systems to resist the constant pressures to do concessions that generate revenue. In addition, concessions create jobs, and that feels like modernity and progress for people who are poor in the developing world. Even if those jobs cannot be sustained in the long run, even if it's undermining human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and so on. Market pressures in a global economy in which clean air and water and oceans and other renewable resources are simply underpriced, and in which, in the absence of a price on carbon, forests are undervalued. So there's at least one interim solution, which is that we give governments incentives to resist those pressures and to enforce their own rules and regulations. That takes big money. Norway has been a pioneer. It's very interesting that Gro Brundtland is here. Norway has been a pioneer in making deals with Brazil, where it's working really well, with Indonesia and Guyana, which pays those governments on the basis of verified performance in their reducing their rates of deforestation. And don't forget that verification comes in part from the reality that David Wheeler created with Forma and now Global Forest Watch. It takes big money, though, big public money. In the case of the US, if $2 billion a year out of the $30 billion a year that we spend on foreign aid could be used to pay governments after the fact on the basis of verifiable performance, that would be a bridge in terms of valuing forests and compensating and creating incentives for countries to do better, to the day in 2020 when we hope there will be a carbon market. Let me end with a plea. If you are here, as I said, you are a global citizen, aware of these global development challenges, interested in developing the right kind of world for all of us in the future. My plea is that whatever your issue is, whether it's forests or water or inclusive finance or educating girls or health or illicit financial flows, that you find ways to inform yourself about the entire ecosystem, that you at least inform yourself about this wonky policy business at the government level, at the level in Washington, more than in Silicon Valley, and that you bring your own experience and passion and commitment to whatever part of that ecosystem is the one where you can be most effective. But you keep yourself informed about the big picture at what I sometimes call the high altar at which we worship in Washington, D.C., of public policy. Thank you very much.
Hello again. Thank you, Nancy. That was really terrific. And while our panel is going to be on the planet, I'm really pleased that Nancy kicks it off by underscoring the primacy of the issue that we all face in climate change. And climate change is the great exacerbator for many of us of all the work that we do. At the Skoll Global Threats Fund that I have the privilege of leading, we work on pandemics, we work on water, We work on climate change specifically. We work on bad weapon systems, nuclear weapons, other forms of weapons of mass destruction, and regional conflicts. But at the heart of all of them, climate change makes our work harder in every way. It's hard to imagine a global problem that is not made more complex by climate change. So today our panelists are going to talk from various different perspectives, provide us various different anecdotes or vignettes to illustrate the work that they and their organizations do and that they feel passionate about. And I think each time, if we think of what the organizing principle for the health of the planet is, the issues of sustainability, stewardship of resources, increasing population migration, will come back as our organizing principle to the issue that we face in climate change. So our wonderful panel includes Sandy Andelman, and Sandy is the Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President of Conservation International. She's also the founding Executive Director of Vital Signs, a monitoring system that fills a critical need for diagnostic indicators on agriculture, ecosystem health, and human well-being. To my left is Carol Larson, who you heard Nancy talk about, who's the president and CEO of one of the largest and most important foundations in the world, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. Packard is celebrating its 50th anniversary. Carol is celebrating her 10th anniversary as president. I should stop now and let you applaud. While they have contributed significantly to global collaborations around cap and trade and incenting changes in policy, the work that may be of most relevance and interest to this discussion may be the investments that Packard has made in community-based approaches in their work in deforestation that encourage the involvement of citizens, especially indigenous communities. The involvement of community members is crucial to planning, enforcement, and the long-term sustainability of the efforts of Packard, but also the efforts of all of us. I look forward to exploring how this approach also is reflected in their work supporting sustainable maritime fisheries and many other things, where I hope the conversation will go. David Wilk, and it's David Wilk. Unfortunately, there's a typo, a wordo, in the agenda that you've been given, the printed agenda. Oh, David is an upgrade. We're really pleased to have David Wilk here, the lead climate change specialist and acting chief in the Climate Change and Sustainability Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. He coordinated the development of the bank's climate change strategy and their action plan. So we're going to have a chance now with these three wonderful people to pursue all the issues of the planet, the health of the planet, and climate change, and we're going to kick it off with Carol.
Thanks a lot, Larry. That's a big agenda. So I know it's the start of a great 3-day conference, and I'm so glad to be back here again and address this group. I do want to say a little bit about the themes that Jane has said and now Nancy has said about the wisdom of combining heart and mind, of logic and creativity, of having the ingenuity moments, as well as the discussions about strategy. As mentioned, our foundation, I think I'm going in and out. Anyway, should I do anything? Okay, as Larry mentioned, our foundation is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and we are a family foundation. So it's the family foundation established by David and Lucille Packard. David, of course, was co-founder of Hewlett-Packard. And today our board is half family and half general trustees. And we really do try to combine in the $300 million that we give away each year, the power of both the heart and the mind. Everything we work on were issues of interest and passion of David and Lucille, and continue to be interests and passions of the family today. Anyway, so we'll get the mic thing settled, but yell if you can't hear me. But the theme of this conference, of course, is not just heart and mind, but also global goals and citizen solutions. And I want to pick up with the story that Nancy started to tell. And I love the way she was talking about an ecosystem, because I think one of the best things about philanthropy, one of the best tools that we have, or assets or characteristics, is to step back and look at the whole ecosystem and to have the flexibility and agility to fund different pieces of that ecosystem as the context changes. So let me just tell as quickly as I can, we have about 8 minutes each, to about 2 areas of interest that we've had at Packard. The first one is on climate change mitigation. And specifically, I wanted to finish up a story, or at least tell the next chapter of what Nancy started about palm oil. As you know, preventing deforestation is an important lever, one of the most important levers in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and slowing climate change. Palm oil is a rapidly growing in popularity product, a miracle product, some people talk about it, with 1,000 different uses, from being used in Girl Scout cookies to cooking oil to candy bars to ice cream to shampoo. And it's growing in popularity because it is easy to grow and it has a high yield per acre. And so it's been growing about 9% a year in terms of sales globally. And so great organizations like the Center for Global Development, great bilateral institutions and development institutions like the Norway government that you mentioned, we're doing a lot of work in terms of how can they slow the rates of deforestation that were forests being cleared to make way for the palm plantations. And so, as Nancy said, you need a whole ecosystem. And there had been moratoriums that had been passed in Indonesia about palm oil expansion, but it was stalling and it wasn't moving very quickly. Packard stood back 3 years ago, along with several other foundations, and said, what more can we do to speed up progress in this area? And so we started to fund a number of, there were voluntary certification processes, but we also started to fund citizen engagement. Greenpeace, Rainforest Action Network, we started to fund Ceres, and also the Aid Environment Organization out of the Netherlands that focused on investment decisions. We started to fund Climate Advisors, which works with companies, and Forest Trust, which works with companies that want to make a change. So basically looking at the supply chain at all those places, the consumer activism, the working with companies that want to make a change, and also trying to pressure the investment decisions through organizations like Ceres or Aid Environment. And just at the end of last year, the largest trader in palm oil around the world, Wilmar International, announced that it would adopt a no deforestation, no peat, that's peatlands is one of the areas that gets converted for growth of palm oil, and no exploitation policy. 40% of the world market is influenced by Wilmar. In addition, Kellogg's has made a commitment. A number of other companies have made commitments like this. And as Nancy said, we believe that it takes actions like CDG, it takes actions from government, it takes actions from the citizens groups, and you as philanthropists get a chance to step back and learn about those ecosystems and to deploy your money where some others perhaps can't. And if activism isn't your bag, there are other places that you can do, like supporting CGD. But that was a huge breakthrough, and of course now we have to deliver on that promise in terms of actually getting those standards in place. And it's going to take an ecosystem for that as well on all of these fronts. So I know my time is running out, so I just wanted to talk about one more area of citizen engagement around global goals, another area where the Packard Foundation long-term investment, and that is around marine reserves. We really do care about biodiversity in the ocean for both the value of biodiversity, but also for the productivity of the oceans, for the livelihoods, the economic stability that they provide. And of course, the Western Pacific is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world, and it also has many millions and hundreds of millions of people who are dependent on the oceans for their livelihood. Places like Fiji and Palau have relatively weak governance systems to deal with protecting those nearshore oceans. So a little over a decade ago, working with Wildlife Conservation Society, World Wildlife Fund, and also some of the universities and NGOs in Fiji and Palau. We started to work with local communities who did depend on the near coast fisheries for their livelihood to set up locally managed marine reserves. So these are small communities, traditional governance systems, but they really care about the health of the oceans outside of their homes. After about 7 years of these locally managed marine areas, there were over 300 of them in these Western Pacific islands. And a network, for example, in Fiji started to be formed among the locally managed marine areas. So there's been huge progress in terms of local communities taking responsibility for monitoring the health of their fisheries that they depend on. But of course, the world keeps happening, and pressure from tourism, from Asia, pressure for development, pressure on the governments, like Nancy was talking about. Those locally managed areas aren't going to be the solution. It's time for us, and we're working on this with other foundations, to connect up even more those locally marine managed areas to be influential with their regional governments and with their national governments. It's an interplay between both, back and forth. It takes both to make progress on these issues. So the final thing I'll say is that as philanthropists, you do get a chance to be agile and flexible, and I think one of the most important things is collaboration among philanthropists. And in both of these examples, we're involved with major collaborative networks, particularly ClimateWorks and the Climate Land Use and Alliance. And if you would like more information about it, check out our website or email me, but I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And I think that's right in the sweet spot of what we're talking about when we talk about planet's physiology, sustainability, and stewardship. And you talked about palm oil and fisheries. Those are two great exemplars of the issues that we face. And you talk about monitoring, which is what Nancy also talked about when she mentioned satellite monitoring. And satellite monitoring as a way to give activists the tools to know where to go and who to intervene with. And I just came back 2 weeks ago. I don't know, you all know the Skoll Foundation and our wonderful leader there, Sally Osberg, who's going to be speaking here a little while. That's my sister foundation. And every year we have a meeting in Oxford. And this year one of the keynote speakers was with a company called Planet Labs. This is not an endorsement of a single company, but they represent a category of satellite launching companies that instead of launching very large $1 billion or $100 million satellites, they're launching constellations of $100,000 satellites. So the data acquisition are 2 orders of magnitude less expensive, and their motivation is different. They're doing this to get information to provide you and all of the NGOs that you're working with daily observational data of the Earth. And their ability to see fisheries that have been laid waste to, palm oil groves, palm that have been cut down, and deforestation all over is really breathtaking. So I'm optimistic that here we are in Silicon Valley, that the convergence of philanthropy and technology will indeed solve some of the problems that we face. And in that regard, coming right back to climate change, David, you're up.
Thank you very much, Larry, and thank you very much for inviting us to present a little bit our developments from our perspective. A lending institution with 24 borrowing members in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, and 24 non-borrowing members. And we lend in the order of $11 billion a year to a range of projects that you probably have heard, and you know, in all sectors: infrastructure, social, education, health, etc. Looking at the first 3 hours of this engagement, I cannot avoid looking at or pointing at our sustainability principles, which are really at the core of our action and has been our flagship. And this is where most of our climate change actions are rooted. This is looking at social policy and equity. Many people here are interested in the poverty reduction. We are looking at institutions for growth, strategy that we have, which is basically providing the right governance. Regional and global integration, which is looking at trade and South-South integration, and a private sector development, which is basically an explicit strategy that we have approved lately to boost the performance of our private sector windows in our activity. Now, our story goes back in climate about 8 years with the Sustainable Energy and Climate Change Initiative. We decided not to go into carbon markets, and we decided to provide more of a platform for technical assistance, managing donor funds, multi-donor funds. We responded to an interest of many of our donor countries to allocate monies to start building capacity and strengthening our stakeholders. After a few years, we managed to mobilize quite a few resources with quite a few replenishments. Lately, about 3-4 years ago, we adopted the strategy itself and an action plan. And the action plan has basically established the key priorities for bank activity in climate. One and foremost, adaptation, which is an area that has been financially lagging, I think, and given the amounts of resources needed for adaptive actions. On the mitigation side, very much addressing and tapping on the opportunities that our region has in terms of renewables. We're talking about solar potential, wind, marine, and geothermal, which has been largely unattended. So let me just bring you to two examples of how we have materialized some of this engagement in technical assistance and actually trying to create more sophisticated financial arrangements for action. On the mitigation side, given that deforestation, land use change and deforestation is one of our biggest challenges, 47% of our emissions come from that sector. We are looking at innovative schemes such as creating a bioclimate fund, for instance, to compensate forest growers and communities along transport corridors to protect forests. This is basically something that requires lots of engagement and special arrangements to basically come up with a kind of a scheme that looks like a payment for environmental services, but with more advanced verification methods, such as those pointed out earlier by Nancy here. This is verified performance. We are looking at private investors as well to complement what countries can provide for forest protection. In this case, we're talking about Colombia and Peru. On the renewables, there's a range of opportunities in areas that have a huge solar potential. We're talking about north of Chile, for instance, that can establish a very widespread and forward-looking energy provision through concentrated solar power. Lately, we are now very engaged in creating a geothermal facility that basically will start from a very low point in terms of developing the capacity for geothermal. This is in the case of Chile and Mexico. So we have a broad agenda to discuss. We believe that national public resources are not enough to carry out and face the challenges. As an institution, we have very heavily engaged in have been heavily engaged in mobilizing international resources as well. We have been very active in establishing programs, financing programs for under the Clean Investment Fund, specifically through the Clean Technology Fund. And we believe that the joint public and private sector engagement is critical, given the needs faced by the region.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I didn't include, and Sandy, I think you're going to talk to us about monitoring so that we are able to follow the changes as they occur in real time. And this wonderful group that you have by your side. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Larry. Conservation International used to be a traditional biodiversity organization. We worked on creating protected areas around the world, and we were very successful at that. But about 4 years ago, we took stock and really realized that creating protected areas wasn't enough, and that if we didn't really engage with development and change the trajectory of development, we simply couldn't succeed in the world we live in today. And my own background, I've spent really the last 40 years working in some of the most remote places in the world, figuring out how to measure biodiversity, track what's happening to ecosystems and the people who depend on them. But I'm also really kind of a data geek. And so from that perspective, about 4 years ago, we started a conversation with the Gates Foundation. And the Gates Foundation's agricultural development program focuses on smallholder farmers and people who, farm areas the size roughly of a football field, and they depend on those areas for their food and their incomes. And so at the time we started that conversation, the Gates Foundation's agriculture program was focused on 3 things. So delivering better seeds, delivering better technology, and better access to markets so farmers could sell their products. And it's a fabulous objective, and no one can really argue with the foundation's logic. But from our perspective, there was really something fundamentally missing, which was, no matter how good the seeds a farmer has, no matter, what technology they have access to, fundamentally, farmers and people everywhere really need nature to thrive. So without sufficient water, without healthy soils, without pollinators, it doesn't matter what seeds and technology a farmer has. A farmer can't thrive, and they can't sustain agricultural productivity without these services from nature. So we actually set about trying to prove that essentially there are a set of vital signs, the equivalent of the signs that a doctor uses, temperature and blood pressure, to evaluate whether people are healthy. And we set out to prove that there are a small set of vital signs that essentially we can use to manage the health of agriculture systems, the health of ecosystems, and the health of human systems in an integrated way. So essentially, we wanted to change the way we measure success. So traditionally, the measures of success for agriculture have been change in crop yield and change in income. So it's not surprising that agriculture degrades the environment because there haven't been measures of success for the environment. And similarly, the traditional measures of success for conservation have been the percent of the Earth's land and waters that are set aside in protected areas. So it's not surprising that there are conflicts between development and conservation. So working with a group of about 150 scientists and policymakers from all over the world, and particularly the Earth Institute and CSIR in South Africa, we have identified a set of measures a set of vital signs that essentially enable us to track the health of farming systems, ecosystems, and human systems. And we've begun actually measuring these systems. We've started in Africa because 2/3 of the world's arable land not currently cultivated is in Africa. We're in, vital signs is in 5 countries. So this is Tanzanians, Ghanaians, Rwandans, now Ugandans, measuring all of these things on the ground and using high resolution and moderate resolution satellite imagery to tie it all together and scale it up. And it's real. And it's not expensive, and it's already beginning to redefine success. The Gates Foundation's new agriculture strategy actually addresses the need to sustain natural resources for future generations. I was just with the Minister of Water from Tanzania, and he wants to convene ministers from 10 countries in Africa to share with them how the data from vital signs is changing decisions that the government of Tanzania is making. So I'll just end by saying that we have to really start managing the planet as a system, whether it's a household, a farm plot, a landscape, a nation, to the globe. We have to have the information that enables us to manage the planet as a system. And if you think about it, you know, when NASA sends astronauts into space, they have a life support system. And the foundation of that system is a set of life-critical measurements that enables managing the astronauts' supply of air, of water, and of food. And the situation we're in with our planet of shrinking resources, we need essentially a command and control system for monitoring the health of the planet and the health of people.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we get about 10 minutes to ask questions and talk among the panelists, and then you get to ask questions. So let me give you a head start to start thinking about the questions that you're going to ask, and then as before, there'll be monitors going around with microphones. And so think about your questions now, and I'll start with the first question. And it's not a new question, but I think it's at the heart of the problem that we face when we're dealing with increasing population, pressure on resources, all resources. In fact, I heard Jared Diamond once speak. He wrote Collapse, anthropologist at UCLA, and he said, we're running out of all of our resources. We're running out of water. We're running out of climate to store all the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases. We're running out of fish. We're running out of trees. But the most important thing that we're running out of, the resource that we're running out of fastest, and that's the most important, is time. We're running out of time. And the loggerheads that we find ourselves at, the developing world, the United States primarily says, I don't want to enter into a global compact and agree to restrict my use of fossil fuels, while the developing world is accelerating so quickly that anything we do would be drowned out by a resurgent China or India or Brazil. The developing world says, you know, you guys are pigs. You're the major source of the accumulated problem that we have. It's our turn. How can you stop us our legitimate right? And David said it perfectly. He said, this conflict between development and climate, between development and stewardship and sustainability, it's really one of the key issues that we face in climate change. What observations do you have from your perspective? I asked the panelists. how do we think about this? Carol, you want to take a crack at it? Send anybody? David? Carol?
Well,
Yep.
please.
Go ahead. Well, you're right. I mean, that's a fundamental conflict. I think an element of hope here is that on some of these big global threats, we're realizing our interdependence. And while there are historical and current day arguments about it's our time to consume or our time to have the same development in the same way that the Western world has, that the choice for that, and I think people realizing that the choice for that isn't there anymore because of our interdependence. So the same climate and the same oceans that affect the United States affect Latin America, affect China. And also that increasingly the efficiencies that any country can get by moving toward more sustainability are becoming apparent. So I think many of us are very interested in what's happening in China, where they're really balancing both the health and desires of the Chinese people for healthy living with their desire for development. And the good news is that there are some tools that the Chinese government is already deploying that can help meet both. But that balance of the water quality and the air quality with how will they develop is so important and is becoming more focused in that country. We started working there in 1998 in China with the China Sustainable Energy Program. At that point in time, our understanding was the Chinese government had about 4 people who were knowledgeable about renewable energy. And in California, we had already had a lot of progress on this, and we had like 400 in the state government. So what Packard did, working with UC Berkeley and Lawrence Livermore Labs and others, was to make available to the Chinese government the best experience in terms of renewable energy, appliance efficiency. And I think today that expertise is much more there, and obviously there's a lot of momentum on those issues in China. But I do think that interdependence offers us some hope of doing it in a different way.
Well, just briefly, I think that when we bring our agenda locally to our stakeholders, cities or communities, we always find ourselves in terms of trying to argue about whether we go through the mitigation window or through the adaptation window. Obviously, the adaptation window looks and sounds more relevant locally. But I think that for us, a big challenge is to stop that divide and do a marriage of mitigation and adaptation objectives into something that will look a resilient environment. And we're looking closely at convergence and complementarities between mitigation and adaptation, and I think that we have a plus there. Reducing deforestation provides great services in terms of biodiversity, hydrologic balance, and practices that will ultimately build resilience in local communities. So whether you emit or not, whether you are suffering as a consequence of global emissions, that issue becomes less relevant, and the argument about benefiting from both mitigation and adaptation is tangible. Energy efficiency is something that we should pursue, not because we are reducing emissions, because there's a clear economic savings in pursuing that objective. Sustainable transport in cities is something that we try to push for together with better land use planning. Why? Because it will create benefits not just in emission reduction, but in everything else as well. We are very keen in deepen our involvement in territorial approaches, geographic approaches, including watershed management, that will prove both mitigation and adaptation benefits as valuable.
Since you have two choices to respond to that one or to another, you choose. The other one's going to be, just in the interest of time, to all people that are here who are beginning to embark on work with climate change, would you recommend that they work globally for a global treaty, or that they work on American political sentiment, on advocacy, since we seem to be the anchor that's holding back the world in many ways? Your choice.
That's a tough choice. I did want to say just briefly that one of the things that makes me hopeful about the trajectory of development is maybe surprisingly private sector companies, and really seeing the shift in the private sector in their attitude towards resources and managing resources more efficiently because they're worried about their supply chains. But part of it also relates to your second question, Larry, which is with with social media, with Twitter, things like that. It's no longer possible for companies or for governments to really get away with bad behaviors, with managing resources badly, because it's on the internet, whether it's Ushahidi or Twitter. The responsibility is there, and I think it's a really powerful force for change.
Thank you. So now we have remaining time for you to ask any questions you want, and we're going to solve all the problems of the world, the planet, resources, sustainability, and we have our first question over there. If a monitor would please bring them.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Carla. I'm from Brazil. I'd like to ask you if the vital system, the vital science system, if it's included an economic dimension to it. And another question to the panel is, what do you think is the main challenge to include externalities in the real value of products and services? What do you think is the main challenge to include externalities, which are all the environmental products and whatever that we use, in the real value of products and services?
Yeah. So I'll repeat it. I think, how do we figure out an economic system that internalizes the negative externalities associated with climate change and the environment? Is that correct? And the whole life cycle systems.
So yes, vital signs does include an economic dimension. And part of what we did, we started with the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Survey, which is an instrument used by countries worldwide to measure poverty, and added into that the environmental measures. So in fact, we can measure what's the value to farmers in Tanzania of forests. And in Tanzania, farmers are earning about 50 cents a day from agricultural production, and we found that they're getting another 56 cents a day in services free from nature. So in energy, they're getting from burning fuel wood or charcoal, in protein from wild fish and bushmeat, in nutrients that they're mining from their soils. So in essence, what Vital Signs found was that if Tanzania loses its forests, the government is going to have to double crop yield, not to lift 2 million people out of poverty, which is their aim. If they lose their forests, they're going to have to double yield just for farmers to have the same standard of living they have today.
So if I could have other people raise your hand, even if you're not the next one called on, so the monitors can find you and we can go quickly.
Can I say something about the externalities?
Sure.
And bring that in?
Please.
So I just wanted to mention a couple. One is I think that investor and consumer demand is going to lead to more accountability in terms of including environmental externality costs to decision making by companies or governments. And I just wanted to give a shout out to one project that we haven't invested in yet, but Moore Foundation, Bloomberg and others, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board effort, which is to take a FASB kind of model and make it a part of a standardized reporting of companies to include sustainability indicators. And they have a website, and it's a very interesting effort. So I think it's that kind of thing that can help move us forward, but it's going to take that consumer activism and that investor activism that we talked about earlier.
And even Siri is trying to get generally accepted accounting principles to impair assets held by fossil fuel companies because of the likelihood they'll never get them all around. Can I see some questions now, more from the audience? Over here, and then if there's another microphone for a follow-up question. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Cruiser from Rockefeller Brothers Fund. This has been wonderful presentations, very exciting. And 2/3 of the emissions problem has, until just now, not been mentioned, and that's fossil fuels, which has garnered a lot of attention because we've heard recently from the International Energy Agency that 2/3 of the fossil fuels that are already on the books, in other words, part of the valuation of the fossil fuel companies, if they are developed, sold, and burned, we are on a trajectory for an inhabitable planet, full stop. And thus, a number of foundations and others have started to react, moving towards divestment, et cetera. I would like to just invite comment from the panelists on this other critical aspect of the climate challenge we face.
Yeah, I mean, there's particular activity that I know at Harvard and Stanford trying to get those universities to be leaders of the divestment movement as they were at the issue of South Africa. And I don't know, anyone behind that or supporting that? Do you support the divestment movement, divesting in companies who have fossil fuels? Yes? No? Complicated? Anybody here want to comment on that? Ducking it? Okay,
Yep.
well, it's complicated. It's complicated. I support it. Next question. Yeah, please.
RTC Impact Fund. My question is about whether and how you think we can actually deal with these the scale of problem without addressing global financial equity.
Okay. The other one wasn't complicated.
Yeah, none of these are, yeah. Go ahead.
David, you want to take that on?
Global financial inequities.
How can we solve the symptoms without dealing with some of the causes? Carol?
I want to ask Chet. He's a good friend of mine. What do you think, Chet?
Well done.
What do the rest of you think? I mean,
The way I framed it was, can we deal with these issues without dealing with equity? My answer is no.
yeah, I mean, I would agree, and I think that part of this ecosystem of where you invest and how far up the chain or how much where you invest is philanthropy is a tough question. And you have to look at the whole play, and certainly economic inequity and financial inequity is a big driver of it. So I think that's part of the benefit of a conference like this, is to think about where you and your individual philanthropy can plug in on pushing on that angle versus some of the ones that I've talked about with Packard.
If I can, I'll tie that into, Carol, what you were talking about before, as what we used to think of as the developing world comes to grips with the global problem that we all face. When I first went to China, which was a couple of decades ago, wherever you would go, I'm sure many of you had the same experience, and you would ask people about their aspirations, I would always hear this phrase that I thought was Chinese. And they would say, yes, then we'll have 2 cars for everyone, and we'll have roads, just like you. And I thought, just like you was a Chinese expression, because I heard it so often, just like you. Well, they don't say that anymore. They're wiser in many ways. They've had to see the model that we've pursued, the reckless consumerism. And I think it's one of the best things that's come out of it, is that change. David, you have the final word. And then
well, we see clearly an equity discussion in many of our countries that rely heavily on hydropower. And the sustainability of hydropower is really threatened by these exacerbated changes in weather. And when we address hydropower companies. They are more willing now to accept that there's an equity issue and that their the sustainability of their infrastructure heavily depends on the scheme that will consider transferring benefits to local communities that are planned and will be engaged in preserving the livelihood of that infrastructure, such as preserving the upper watersheds, for instance, in terms of controlling soil erosion and maintaining the quality of operation of dams. So we do see clearly an equity issue there. And we are exploring and responding to this openness of these companies to engage more in more distributional project strategies to compensate and to engage local communities and have them benefit from that conservation practice.
Thank you very much. And I would ask, please join me in thanking our panel for really a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, David. Thank you, Sandy.